However, it's based on an ideology called anti-objectivist art, which comes from the 1960s and was largely part of the hippie movement. John Lennon was involved extensively in anti-objectivist art. Do you remember getting into a bag for peace? This is where a naked John Lennon, covered with hair, would get into a bag, and Yoko Ono would draw, who was a member of a group called Fluxus, would draw the zip on the bag, and Lenin would stay there for a day, because the idea was that if we were all naked and in bags, and covered with hair, we wouldn't fight. And there would be no more war, and there would be a realm of peace on this earth for us all to enjoy. You know, another Fluxus fad that Yoko was very keen on was the revelation of the buttocks. They would sit there naked before the NBC and CBS and ABC and the BBC and all the big channels of that era, revealing their naked buttocks, because of course you won't fight if you reveal yourself in that way. And the point was to avoid struggle by not fighting. These ideas had little currency and didn't last too long. But anti-objectivist art begins there, and somebody like Stewart begins his particular intellectual career at this time. Holmes an anarchist, essentially, or a libertarian communist, or an anarcho-communist. His one claim to fame is writing a book. He's written many books, but his one real claim to fame is a book called The Assault on Culture. The Assault on Culture. From Lettrism to Class War, it's called. And he deals with a miscellany of extreme left avant-garde groups that come out of the major modernist tendencies as they end. Modernism is a very complicated area, goes back to the middle of the 19th century. It's a reaction in part against photography. It's a desire to go inside the mind and fantasize. Was despised for much of the late 19th century, early part of the 20th century, then became the major aesthetic discourse of liberal humanism. There's a complication there, because both fascism and communism flirted with modernism. Most of them then turned against it, although the Portuguese, Spanish and Italian far-right regimes made use of moderate modernist tendencies. Modernism's always had a devilish side from the perspective of left humanism, because a lot of the early modernists were fascists, were anti-humanists, and were radical rightists, like Ezra Pound, like Wyndham Lewis, like Marinetti, like Gordie-Beska, like Celine, and so on, like Marinetti. That's because there was an anti-democratic element to it, because of course modernism was a bohemian attack upon the sensibility of the majority. It loathes what ordinary people think about art, so it will destroy what they want and impose what intellectuals want. And it's a sort of vanguard hostility to the boring majority, you know, bomb the suburbs. That's the sort of view of modernism. But that can tend to the right as well as the left in strange moments, because national cultures were still alive to the degree that there could be national modernisms. Expressionism was a largely Germanic form, Futurism was an Italian form, Surrealism was a French form. Surrealism was the only major modernist movement that linked formally with communism through the radical state socialist ideas of its founder, André Breton. Basically, Surrealism died with him. But as it died, all sorts of shards came out of it, one of which was called situationism. Situationism was a minor ideological current that's achieved quite a bit of currency, particularly on the far left, because a lot of the students in 1968 mouthed situationist slogans. The media was convulsed to find that when, on the one hand, there were these hippies sort of throwing bricks at members of the CRS, a very tough central riot police in Paris and the other big cities. But they would paint these slogans on walls saying, "Seize the imagination," or "Release the factories," or "I want to play with myself," or something like that. You know, strong, powerful philosophical stuff like this that they would spray paint on these walls. And most of these were situationist slogans taken from a book called Society of the Spectacle, written by Guy Debord in the late 1960s. Debord later committed suicide in dubious circumstances. There was another intellectual associated with this tendency called Raoul van Ergem, who wrote the Book of Pleasures and the Revolution of Everyday Life. Now, these books had a lot of impact in revolutionary artistic scenes. It's very interesting to notice this combination of far-left art, anti-social practice, misanthropy, and extreme amounts of money, and their ability to attract each other in disassociative ways. Anti-objectivist art began as a hostility to the art market. It began by producing artworks that no one would want to buy. That was the whole point. You were rebelling against the market. They used to have marches on Sotheby's saying, "Death to Sotheby's, death to Sotheby's." Now they're all sold in Sotheby's for enormous amounts of money. The most classic example of this was an Italian conceptual artist in the 1970s called Manzoni. And Manzoni used to sell blocks of his own ordure. He used to sell blocks of his own ordure in gold-tinted, beautifully framed sort of 18th century gold leaf tins. And Italian-American air services used to buy this for $7,000, $7,000 a tin, you know, to say at their kinky and trendy party that I bought one, you know. And that, in a sense, it was, because artists always loathe the dealers. They always loathe the middlemen, a third of whom have always been of a certain ethnicity. Always. Third of art dealers are Jews, third of art dealers are homosexuals. Not always an overlapping category. And but artists loathe the middlemen. And there's a desire to revenge yourself on the middlemen by producing work that can't be sold, that's impossibilist, if you like. But the market can sell anything. You can sell debt as an asset from which you can make more money. So why not sell cars that are bolted together? There's a famous case of one artist who was neo-conceptual and was an action artist who tried to sell his dead body after he committed suicide. This was a man called Schwarzkogler, who was Austrian, and he wound himself in mummification and either did commit suicide or feigned to commit suicide. I hope not to ruin anyone's appetite by some of this, but it's all true, I assure you this. There's several other ones who left bits of their bodies, including arms and legs, in various galleries and so on. And this was photographed in the 1970s. This was action art, wasn't it? I mean, let's face it, there's something was going on here. Holmes' book, The Assault on Culture, has Schwarzkogler's pre-corpse mummified body on its front, so you know what you're getting. Now, the movements with which Holmes deals are situationism, of which he's a left-wing critic. In other words, he's a critic from the left, within the left. He's a critic of, there's lecturism, which is another idea that relates to certain formalist and linguistic ideas. There's a movement for the Imagist Bauhaus, which is a splinter from Breton surrealism. There are also slightly dangerous movements, because Holmes has an equivocal element. Not in what he wants, but in what will happen. One of the dangers about the cult of the new and the cult of the future is that there can be different futures that left-wing people don't like. And there was a movement in the 1970s called mail art. And this woman would do these traditional biographical pictures, very traditional academic art, the sort of thing Orpen would have done at the turn of the 20th century and just in and around the Great War. And she would send them to people. She would send them to the Prime Minister. She would send them to the Pope. She would send them to the Chief Rabbi. And they were all pictures of Adolf Hitler. And they opened them and were appalled at this, you know, and it was quite a scandal. And she said, but I'm not a Nazi. She said, I'm just being transgressive. You know, I'm doing what is non-bourgeois. You know, Hitler may have done evil things, but I'm not evil. I'm just painting a picture. It's just representation. So you see, if you adopt the cult of the new, and Holmes had this idea called neoism, where he wants to create culture anew, which is largely based on Marinette's ideas that you can bomb everything and begin again because we are the masters of the ruins. It's the rhetoric of people who've never been to a real war, you see, as those who were just about to, because a lot of this stuff came out in 1912 and was just the quivering in the antennae of the Armageddon that was about to erupt. Although, to be frank, many of the Marinetteists, the futurists, actually did fight in the war, because they believed in war. They glorified war. We glorify men. We glorify war. You know, this is why they link with Mussolini later, you know, and or some of them did. Now, Holmes' work is based upon the idea that you can go beyond the left and push even that which is left-wing further left. You see, he's in this odd position because the left never thinks it's won. Even when it's triumphant, even when many dons agree with some of their assumptions, they think it's not gone far enough. The revolution's been betrayed. You need to be pushed further. More radicalism, more self-criticism, more anti-essentialism. It's not enough. Turds in a box, not enough. You know, deconstructing classic opera, not enough. Turandot and other operas now, even in the West End, they often have a urinal on the stage. Urinal, what's that about? That's Duchamp's idea of the ready-made, you see. This plate is art. Who are you to say it's not? I look at this work, I mediate it, I objectivise it as my view of life. The stained dregs of life in this coffee cup, life ending in doom. Didn't Beckett say they were born amidst they were born over a grave, there's a cry and then it's all over? You see, art! So I want 2,000 for this now, who'll give it to me? And that's how that sort of thing starts. I heard of one bloke at English National Opera, and the critic said, slightly bemused, he said, what a toilet on the stage? And he said, well, we're acting against the piece. We put the thing on, but we try and destroy it as we put it on. It's deconstruction. And you know why these ideas have got a hold? Because they're bored.